Paul Heyman has one of wrestling's most brilliant minds and one of its most impossible personalities. He spent his whole career rubbing people up the wrong way, but every now and then someone does the same to him. Back in 1992, Bill Watts was one of those people. Heyman was already a well-established character in WCW at this point. He was managing the Dangerous Alliance, but he was also doing commentary and working behind the scenes too. Heyman was an important part of the promotion. That was until Bill Watts showed up. He was brought in to run WCW as Executive Vice President, and he hated everything Heyman stood for. In his eyes, Heyman was a loudmouth punk who got paid way too much and didn't respect the business, and according to multiple reports, he also made it deeply personal. Heyman has said in interviews that he'd never experienced real anti-Semitism in wrestling until he worked under Bill Watts. Watts allegedly hurled anti-Semitic slurs at Heyman backstage, calling him a Jew fucker and referring to him and Medusa as the Jew and the cunt in front of other staff. But Heyman didn't just sit back and take it. During one meeting backstage, he reportedly brought in a printout of an old interview that Watts did with the Pro Wrestling Torch newsletter, where he defended racial segregation, arguing that private business owners should be allowed to refuse service to black customers. According to witnesses, Watts exploded in response and fired off another bunch of anti-Semitic slurs at Heyman, this time in front of the entire meeting room. Not long after that, Heyman was fired. The official reason was falsified expense reports, but according to Dave Meltzer, Heyman responded by filing a lawsuit for wrongful termination and ethnic discrimination with WCW. The case was reportedly settled out of court, and while the terms were never disclosed, it's believed the payout was for a significant amount of money. Some say that it gave Heyman the finances he needed to take over and rebrand Eastern Championship Wrestling into Extreme Championship Wrestling. And by 1997, Heyman had transformed ECW into something special. It was now a violent, renegade alternative to the WWF. That year, as part of a storyline between the two companies, ECW invaded Monday Night Raw, and right in the middle of it, you could feel the tension between Heyman and Jerry Lawler. And the hate between the two men wasn't just for TV, it was real, and it went back to the late 80s when Heyman was working for Lawler in his Memphis territory as a manager. He was managing Austin Idol and Tommy Rich during their feud with Lawler, which was one of the biggest angles in Memphis at the time. The whole thing had been built up over weeks, with Heyman constantly getting involved, and the crowd were whipped up into a frenzy, wanting to see him get his ass whipped. To pay the feud off, Lawler booked a scaffold match. The plan was for Heyman to climb up the scaffold with him, where he'd either take a bump or beg for mercy in front of the crowd. But Heyman refused to do it. He told Lawler that he wasn't comfortable with heights and he didn't want to risk climbing up there. And so, after all those weeks, the payoff never happened, and Lawler said that it completely killed the angle. He also claimed that they ended up getting into a fight backstage over it, and that he was so angry that he punched Heyman. From that point on, their relationship was never the same. Years later, when ECW showed up on Monday Night Raw, that tension came back to the surface. Lawler spent the entire time burying ECW on commentary, calling it garbage, mocking the wrestlers, and treating Heyman like it was a joke. But Heyman was right there at the desk with him, and he fired right back, saying that Lawler's style was outdated and calling him a relic from a dead era. But during that invasion storyline, ECW was at the height of its power as a real alternative to WCW and the WWF, and it had a cult following of devoted fans. But just a few years later, and the cracks were starting to show. Running a wrestling company at that level meant big expenses, and the money wasn't coming in fast enough to cover any of it. Heyman was a creative genius, but as a businessman, he was out of his depth. He was struggling to pay the roster, and his wrestlers were starting to leave the company. Raven, Shane Douglas, Taz, the Dudley Boys, even the likes of Mikey Whipwreck and the Sandman all left ECW to go to WCW and the WWF. Even Tommy Dreamer, the most loyal guy in the company, was holding things together with hopes and prayers. By the year 2000, the majority of the locker room had lost faith in Heyman. And that's when Mike Awesome walked out of the company too, while he was still the world champion. And then, with no warning, he showed up on WCW Nitro. According to Awesome himself, his ECW contract had expired and he hadn't been paid for months. He said that he refused to sign a new contract until Heyman paid him what he was owed. When that didn't happen, he went to WCW. So you can argue that Awesome was just looking after himself, and he was, but for Heyman, it didn't matter. The guy he'd trusted had walked out while he was still the champion during ECW's darkest hour. Heyman fired back, threatening legal action, claiming that Awesome was still under contract, and he demanded that WCW take him off TV. Behind the scenes, WCW's legal team didn't take that very seriously. According to Eric Bischoff, Heyman was bluffing and there wasn't a signed ECW contract, just verbal agreements and handshakes. Eventually, Heyman struck a deal with the WWF to bring Taz back to ECW for one night, just long enough to beat Awesome and get the world title off him. 5 years later, and WWE presented an ECW tribute show called One Night Stand. Heyman himself was given free rein to book the show, and despite any possible animosity, he hired Mike Awesome to wrestle Masato Tanaka. The crowd that night was full of rabid ECW fans, and they booed Awesome out of the building, not because he was a heel, but because they all remembered how Mike Awesome walked out of the company while still holding the world title. It's possible that Heyman only brought Awesome back in order to humiliate him in front of a hostile crowd. By the early 2000s, Heyman had lost ECW, but Vince McMahon still recognised his creative genius. He brought Heyman onto the WWE creative team, first writing for SmackDown, then later contributing to Raw. Raw's head writer at the time was Brian Gewirtz. He came from a traditional writing background and liked things to be scripted and structured in a very orderly way, as if he was writing for a Hollywood TV show. Heyman, on the other hand, had a looser approach to writing wrestling shows. He wanted the wrestlers to feel like real people, not actors reciting dialogue. So when these two were expected to coexist backstage, it went exactly how you'd expect it to. Heyman would do things like phone into Raw meetings when he wasn't supposed to, and he'd openly question Gewirtz's judgment on things. But those kinds of disagreements quickly escalated. In his book, Gewirtz talks about a time on Vince McMahon's private jet when Heyman challenged him to a fight, and Vince looked genuinely disappointed when Brian said no. At some point, the tension between the men boiled over into a physical confrontation where they started slapping each other, and Stephanie McMahon ended up stepping in and suspending both of them. Heyman didn't make many friends in the writers' room, but his biggest battle behind the scenes was with the boss himself, Vince McMahon. After ECW collapsed, Heyman joined WWE full-time. He replaced Jerry Lawler on commentary in 2001, and he was eventually brought onto the creative team. At first, he was mostly involved with SmackDown, where he helped create the most successful period in the brand's history. But his ideas were constantly getting overruled or watered down, and he got frustrated because Vince had the final say on all of his storylines. And despite the success he was having writing the show, Vince started stripping away his influence. He was quick to give Paul power, but he also seemed to enjoy taking it away from him. And frustratingly for Paul, that happened multiple times over the next few years. in 2006, WWE relaunched the ECW brand and Heyman was given the reins. Well, for a short amount of time. Again, he found a lot of his decisions being overruled, despite being promised that the brand was basically his. For example, Heyman wanted to push CM Punk, but Vince chose Bobby Lashley instead. Heyman wanted grit and realism on the show, just like the original ECW, but Vince insisted on having dumb gimmicks and scripted promos on the show. At the December to Dismember pay-per-view, Heyman and Vince clashed hard. Heyman wanted to protect CM Punk in the Elimination Chamber main event, but Vince overruled him once again. According to multiple accounts, Heyman blew up backstage and screamed in Vince's face. A few days later, he was sent home. No official firing, he was just gone. That was the biggest falling out between them, and it never fully healed. Even as late as 2020, the pattern continued. Vince made Heyman executive director of Raw, and for a while he had real power backstage. But Vince didn't like how the show was being run by Heyman, and so he started rewriting Heyman's scripts and totally ignored all of his long-term plans. It didn't take long before Vince pulled the plug and Bruce Pritchard replaced Heyman instead. Heyman called Vince the greatest wrestling promoter in history, but he also said that Vince burned out everyone around him and that he only ever surrounded himself with yes men. And if there's one thing that Paul Heyman has never been, it's an ass kisser.